Thank you. How are you doing? Good. I noticed nobody's sitting in the front row. You came close. Brave people here. I think the comedian Gallagher ruined it for us all. He was a comedian that used to spray water on people in the front row, but you're safe with me, okay? So, well, it's an honor and a pleasure to be with you here and to share some stories tonight and some ideas about storytelling, which is both entertaining, but it can also be a useful tool, I think, for both personal and cultural change. And that's in part the idea behind the program tonight, which has to do with lessons from Scheherazade. How many of you are familiar with the name Scheherazade? Oh, good, okay. I wanted to start out, however, with a story that's sort of about stories, and it's about a rabbi who is reputed to be a brilliant storyteller. And the nature of his brilliance was that this rabbi always had the right story for every occasion. It didn't matter if it was a funeral or a wedding, a bar mitzvah, if it was a happy occasion, a sad occasion, whatever it was, the rabbi would have the perfect story. And he did this for years and years. And one day, a member of his synagogue came up and said, Rabbi, how do you do this? How do you always find the right story for every occasion? And the rabbi, he thought for a minute, and he said, you know, that reminds me of a story. He said, yes, there was once a king, and this king longed to be a great bowman, a famous archer, and he studied with all the masters of the day. But one day this king was riding his horse through a shtetl, a little village, and he came to the edge of the village and he saw something, and he pulled up the reins on his horse because he saw a dilapidated barn, but somebody had shot a host of arrows into the side of the barn, and every arrow penetrated the exact center of a bullseye. And the king had never seen this quality of marksmanship. And so he went to a nearby farmhouse and he knocked on the door, and a young woman opened the door. And she said, Your Highness, yes, what is it? And the king said, you must tell me, the marksman, who is it that shot these arrows into the side of the barn? And she said, well, that's my son, I'll bring him to you. And she went back and she returned with a 14-year-old boy. And the king said, my boy, I've never seen this quality of shooting. You must tell me, what is your secret? And the boy said, Your Highness, I have no secret. I just go to the barn every day and I shoot some arrows into the side of it, and then I come back on occasion with little cans of paint and I make bullseyes around the arrows. And in that way do I appear as a great marksman. And the rabbi, he said, that's pretty much how it is with me. I just take lots of stories into my head, into my heart, into my imagination. I think upon them, I care for them, and then I find that life comes along at certain moments and paints a little bullseye around one. And in that way do I appear as some great storyteller before you, right? So, a couple ideas behind that. One is that I love what the rabbi says, this connection between arrows in the barn and stories in the heart, because all of us have been penetrated by experiences. We've all lived interesting lives, met interesting people, been places. We've all lived unique lives. And things have penetrated us, have gone into our hearts, into our memories, into our imagination. In part, what separates the rabbi from most of us is that he thought about those experiences, and then he had a ready-made audience that he had to tell stories to because he was a member of a synagogue, right? And so this idea of simply caring for stories over time and finding places here and there to put them is part of the idea of being a storyteller. Because my belief is that we are all storytellers and we all have unique experiences which provide some type of medicine or wisdom or insight or entertainment, And so we'll get a little into doing a little bit of storytelling among ourselves later and also celebrate Father's Day. But first, I wanted to move on to this piece about Scheherazade. And Joseph Campbell, a wonderful mythologist, he once said, myths and fairy tales are stories that are not true, that can often tell a truth better than the truth could tell. Right? Is that confusing enough for you? Right? Because sometimes a story that's a myth or a fable or a folk tale, although it's not literally true, it tells a great truth, like much of art does. I was teaching a class in mythology to a group of 6th graders for a week. And after a week, I said, so, can anyone in the class tell me what a myth is? No hands went up, you know. Finally, a little sheepish hand. And I said, yes, Tim. Tim stood up. He said, yeah, Mr. Hornyak, myths, those are those stories you tell that aren't true, but they keep happening again and again and again. Right? So that's what mythology does and fairy tales do. They point to a pattern that continues to happen again and again and again through time. They may not be literally true, but of course they show us a great truth. And this story is along those lines. They say in a long ago time, in a time before time was measured in days and weeks and hours and seconds and nanoseconds, and before we wore time on our wrists, and before time was pinned on walls and clocks, in a time when people seemed to have time, there lived a sultan, a great, powerful sultan, who ruled for a long time wisely and well, and because of that, his kingdom prospered, his people prospered, there was great harmony and happiness until one day he discovered that his wife, whom he loved dearly, had betrayed him. And he discovered in time that she had betrayed him a number of times with a number of lovers, and he was angry. And in his anger, he had his wife beheaded. And then his anger became rage. And in his rage, he had all of her lovers, all of her consorts beheaded. And then his rage became madness. And in his madness, he said, I will never, ever, ever be betrayed again by a woman. And so he began a strange and terrible custom. Each day near dawn, he would wed a maiden of the kingdom and sleep with her one night and have her beheaded the next day at dawn. In this way, he would never be betrayed. His power was absolute. And so this terrible custom continued for 3 years' time. The people suffered, they were in deep grief, they were angry, but nothing could be done against his power. Now, it just so happened that at that time, there was a vizier, the minister of the sultan. And this minister was actually the one who saw that the beheadings were carried out. He didn't swing the great scimitar, the curved sword, but he was the one that hired the henchmen that did that. But the vizier had 2 daughters. And the oldest one's name was Scheherazade, and the youngest one's name was Dunyazad. And because he was the vizier, the chief minister, his daughters' lives had been spared. Not only that, but somehow they had been kept unawares of these tragedies and these killings. Until one day Scheherazade discovered this. Now Scheherazade, she was a student of the arts and the sciences. She was widely read. And not only that, she was a student of stories, myths, fables, folk tales of all parts of the known world. But she was also a woman of great heart. And when she heard of what in fact was happening, she went to her father. And she said, Father, how long will this madness continue? She said, I tell you, make me the next bride of the Sultan, for I have an idea. And her father said, are you mad? You know what will happen. And she said, I have an idea. And if I can survive, I will gladly be the ransom for my sisters. And he said, I forbid it. And she said, if you forbid it, I will go to the Sultan, send word to him that I long to be your bride. But my father said that to do so would be to marry beneath me. He said, you would not. She said, I would and I will. She was a woman of incredible heart and courage. So the time came. At last, her father relented. The wedding date was set. Now, right before the wedding, Scheherazade, she went to her beloved sister, Dunyazad, and she told her of this idea that she had. So the wedding came. It was more like a funeral than a wedding. And Scheherazade went and slept in the chamber with the Tsar. And then in the deep of the night, there came a knock at the door of the Sultan's chamber. It was Dunyazad. And she said, Scheherazade, she said, sister, please, allow me to see your face one last time before you die. Sister, please. Scheherazade appealed to the Sultan. And he said, I will allow that. And the door opened, and in came Dunyazad, and she sat at the foot of the bed, and you could see them now. Dunyazad sitting there, and Scheherazade laying in the bed with the Sultan. And Dunyazad turned to her sister and said, Scheherazade, please, so that my last memory of you is sweet, sister, would you tell me one of your beautiful stories? Scheherazade said, I will do that. I would love to do that if it is the will of our just and pious and great Sultan. Now, the Sultan had not heard any stories in a long, long time. The only story the Sultan had heard or knew was the story of his own pain and his own grief and his own wounding and his own woe. And so he said, I will allow you to tell a little tale, Scheherazade. He had no idea that he was next to a master teller of tales. And she said, my lord, once upon a time, in a long ago time in India, there was a water bearer, a good man who had 2 clay jugs, and he hung those from a stout stick. And every day the water bearer would make his way from his master's home down a dry, dusty road to the well ahead, and he would fill up the clay jugs and return home day after day, week after week, year upon year. But one day, the water bearer saw that one of the jugs, when he returned home, was half empty. The other was full, where he could see there was a flaw, a slight crack in that jug, and water had leaked out. But he decided to keep that jug in his service. And so it was every day he'd go to the wellhead and fill up the 2 clay jugs, and every day he'd come home, and one would be full and the other half empty. Day upon day, week upon week, year upon year, it was that way. And one day, the flawed jug at the wellhead spoke. This is India. Everything can speak, you know. And the flawed jug said, Master, long have I been in your service, and I know that when we return home, and that one jug is always full, but me, I am half empty, for I am flawed. Why would you keep me, a flawed jug, in your service? And the water bearer said, my flawed jug. He said, it was because of your flaw I kept you in my service. You see, when I found out water leaked from you, I decided to carry wildflower seeds with me in my pocket. And I would cast them out on this side of the road and that side of the road. And on the way home, the water that leaked from you would nourish and water the seeds. In that place that was once a dry, dusty road, now flowers grow everywhere. Colors of every kind. The bees, they buzz there. The birds, they sing there. And many times, in fact, I have brought flowers from that place to my own master's table, who has commented often upon their beauty, which never would have been made possible without that flaw in your side. My flawed jug, all of us are flawed, but you have made great beauty from it. The Sultan listened and he nodded. And he said, do you have another tale? Scheherazade said, I do. And so it was through the night. She wove poem upon tale upon fable. And it was almost like she created a magic carpet with her words and those tales that seemed to lift the Sultan away from that room of pain and woe. And in time, he began to see the world again. In those stories, they traveled from marketplaces to deserts to cities along rivers, and they saw people of every kind and quality and color. And it was almost like a window had been opened into a room that hadn't known fresh air in a long time. The stories had the effect of a soft rain upon the parched heart of the Sultan, which stirred to life now. But as the night wore on, Scheherazade was telling a tale about a merchant, a powerful merchant, but a beloved merchant who had been away for a year's time doing business and collecting debts, but now he was within a day's ride of his home, and his family knew that. He was deeply beloved, and a great feast had been prepared for him, but he stopped on the way home at an oasis. And as he was watering his horse, he took some dates, and he ate the dates, and he took the date pits, and he simply cast them into the oasis. And there just happened to be sleeping there the son of a genie, the invisible son of a genie. It's a fairy tale, people. Work with me here, okay? But those date pits struck him on the head and killed him instantly. Because as I sometimes say, what we do in this world has great effect upon the other world. They killed him, and just like that, this enormous genie, the father of that boy, he rose up and took form, and he cried out, and he said, "Mortal, wicked mortal, you have murdered my son. And now it will be as it always has been, a life for a life." And he unsheathed this enormous curved scimitar. And the merchant, he got on his knees and he said, "No, I would never harm a child. Great master of the jinn, tell me, what have I done? I know not, I wouldn't harm a child." "You have killed mortal, and now you shall die." And again he raised the scimitar, and the sun gleamed upon the blade. It gleamed upon the blade. Scheherazade said, "Master, look, just as the sun is gleaming upon the blade in the story, so it gleams now in our window, for the dawn has arrived, and with it the hour of my death. And so I'm not able to finish this story," which I'm sure you would agree has a most remarkable and surprising conclusion. And it was as if the Sultan woke up from a beautiful dream. He had traveled far away with Scheherazade in his imagination. But he looked around the room and he remembered, and he didn't want to be betrayed again. He didn't want to trust this woman. But he did want to hear the end of the story. And of course, even more than that, he wanted to travel again with Scheherazade into that realm, that beautiful place that he had not visited in so long. And so he said, "Scheherazade, I will grant you one more day of life, but tomorrow will be the last day that you live, so you can finish this little tale of yours." And she bowed to him, and she said, "You are good, and you are great, and you are kind, and I thank you for one more day of life." And away she went. But she came back the next night, and she finished that tale with that sword of death hanging over her head. She finished the story, but then she began another story. And it might surprise you to know she was unable to finish that story at dawn also. She was an artist after all, and they do have trouble with closure, if you know what I mean. And so it was that day upon day, night upon night, Scheherazade came to the Sultan's chamber. And with that sword hanging over her, she wove myth upon fable, upon fairy tale, upon folk tale from China and India and Arabia, from all parts of the world that she had studied. And in time, it was those stories that opened the Sultan's mind once again to many ways of thinking and seeing and being, to many characters that he never would have known otherwise. Some say that it was the many, many threads of the stories that eventually threaded back together, pieced back together the torn fabric of the Sultan's own heart. Scheherazade told stories night upon night for 1,001 nights. And little by little, the Sultan returned to become a ruler of kindness and goodness and compassion as he had once been. And as he did that, the realm once again returned to be a place of prosperity, of harmony. And in time, it might surprise you to know, in time, look at the time. I am so sorry. You know, I don't have the time to finish this story, which goes on for quite some time. But I think you would agree it has a most remarkable conclusion. Thank you. Here's some, what I call 5 lessons from Scheherazade. And of course, there are many, many ideas and lessons in this story, and you can come up with your own. These are 5 things that I've noticed in time looking at this story. First off, number 1 is that we can all become tyrants, you know. We all have a tendency, I know for myself, I'll speak for myself. when I am under stress, when I'm angry, when I'm in deep grief, when I'm confused, I put on the narrow blinders. I don't see life as clearly as I should. And so what happened with the Sultan, of course, was he was so angry and so enraged and in such deep grief, he became what I call a zealot. He had only one story. And the only story he knew was the story of his own pain, his own grief, and his own woe. Now, that story was true. That was absolutely true. He had been betrayed, he had been wounded, he had been hurt. But as a result of that, his pain was so great, he failed to see all the other stories that were happening around him. You know? And that's in part what Scheherazade recognized. There's an old saying that a zealot has only one story. A wise person has many, you know. And so Scheherazade's idea in some way was not to tell the Sultan to do something different, was simply to reseed his imagination in his heart with lots of different stories, you know, to give him lots of different possibilities of how you might think and act and feel and be. She had studied stories for a long time, and in part, stories are about how people get into trouble and how they get out of trouble or not. And so oftentimes, when there is trouble, people that have been around stories a lot can say, oh, this has happened before. Right? She wasn't totally frozen or paralyzed by the idea of the Sultan, but she had an idea, a strategy. The second thing is that you notice Scheherazade worked at night. She didn't work during the day. She didn't go to the Sultan in his chamber of power and say, you should stop doing this, because if she did, what would have happened? Off with the head, right? So she realized that she had to work with him in the bed in the marital chamber. She worked with him during what you could think of as the dream time, a time when we normally dream. And one way of thinking of the Sultan's affliction was that he was no longer able to dream, meaning vision something any different than the present he was living in. He was a complete captive of the present, unable to see any type of shift to make a future that was different from the present. And in part, by telling all the stories, Scheherazade pointed out many, many possibilities for living and for being and for thinking and for acting. And sometimes we think that, especially in our culture, that direct action is the most important. And it is, that is important. But she realized if she took direct action, it wouldn't have helped. So she had to work with the Sultan's subconscious, you might say, and night upon night drop different ideas and stories into his own thinking. A third thing is that a story is always a collaboration between a storyteller and the listener. And the real stage in storytelling is not here, it's in your imagination. And so even though the Sultan was listening to Scheherazade, it was he who was making up all the images. It was he who was creating the landscape. And a good storyteller like Scheherazade isn't just telling you something, she's bringing you into an experience of something. And so the Sultan actually had an experience of these different places and these different people and characters, because that's how a great storyteller works. The fourth thing is that sometimes to solve the problem, you have to marry the problem. Right? It's why when we get married, people bring us gifts and stuff, because they know you're going to be in trouble now, right? She had to gain the right proximity to be able to solve this issue. And so at great risk, she married the Sultan. At great risk, she went to his chamber night upon night, because she realized that you have to be healed in the same way that you are wounded. And the Sultan had been wounded in the marital bed. He had been wounded in relationship. He had to be healed in the marital bed and healed in relationship. Scheherazade understood that. But to do that, she had to get close to the Sultan. You might say she worked alone, and yet at the same time, because she was such a student of all these stories, she showed up with many allies. And that's in part one way of looking at the old stories, the old fairy tales and folk tales, or it could be whatever, movies or drama or whatever. They can be allies for us. Some people say that old stories are like ancestors that continue to speak to us, to offer us wisdom, even in contemporary society, even though they're very old. And Scheherazade was filled with these tales and these ideas and these characters. And so when she saw this problem happening, she didn't think I'm all alone. She thought I have to go here alone, but I do have allies with me. How many of you are familiar with the character of Orpheus, the Greek story? Many of you have. Great, it's great. Great to be with people that know mythology. That's wonderful. Yeah. So this part reminds me a little bit of Orpheus, because you might remember in the gist of the story, he falls deeply in love with a woman named Eurydice. And in no time at all, Eurydice is killed by a serpent, and she's taken away into the underworld. And Orpheus says no. He says, no, this will not happen. And so he appeals to Hermes, and Hermes shows him the way, the entrance to the underworld. And Orpheus goes into the underworld, and all he has are his songs, his poems, and his lyre, his harp. But he sings so beautifully, and his heart is so pure, and his lyre, his music is so lovely, that even the three-headed dog Cerberus lays down and allows Orpheus to pet him. Even Hades himself, the lord of the underworld, hearing Orpheus's music, is so touched that he cries one tear. It is a tear of black tar, but it's a tear nonetheless, But eventually, Orpheus, just like Scheherazade, moves the heart of this sultan, moves the heart of this Hades. Because why? Because all of us have feelings. All of us are touched deeply by emotion. All of us know joy and pain and grief and sorrow and happiness. And that's what the great Scheherazade and Orpheus appealed to. So yes, she went alone, but she also had allies, just the way Orpheus did as well. And the fifth point that I'll make is we are all Scheherazade. All of us carry stories. All of us carry medicine. Just the way the rabbi does. And oftentimes, it's in dire circumstances when our stories, our experiences, the medicine we carry is required. That's why I say it's important to remember the experiences you have had, that you've lived. That's in part the medicine that you carry, the insight that you bring. And so I thought I'd like to have kind of an experiential moment with you so we could do a little bit of storytelling. Very simple. It's Father's Day tomorrow, is that correct? So what I'd like you to do in a moment is just turn to someone next to you and tell a very brief tale about something about your father or someone in your life who acted the role of father for you. My dad was born in 1909, so he was like having a grandfather. He was 46 when I was born. He was a doctor, but he also loved to work with wood. And one thing he told me was, he said, "Will, follow your star." And the other thing he told me was that the difference between a junkyard and a hardware store is organization. Right? So just turn to someone next to you and just tell a very brief tale about your father, and maybe it's something that they said to you or something that they always said or a joke they told, whatever comes to mind. We'll just spend a few minutes doing that. So I always like to know, one thing I love to look out and watch people tell stories, because all of a sudden, I always say when people tell stories, everybody becomes Italian. Everybody starts using their hands and stuff, it's great. So I always like to know, something that somebody said or anything that came up for you, or any sayings that your father said, or anybody wants to say anything that they heard that was interesting, or just go ahead and pipe up. Silence reigned. Anything?
10 cents holding up $1.
What was that?
Hey, that's 10 cents holding up $1. So if you're taking your time, that's 10 cents holding up $1.
That's good. That's good. Hey, my dad had one that if silence was golden, he couldn't raise a dime. Any other? Yes?
I was recalling how my dad used to try to keep the magic alive with our holidays, like Christmas and Easter.
Nice.
So Christmas, he would leave little glass of brandy and a cookie for Santa Claus. And of course, in the morning, we would come downstairs and it would be gone, and there'd be cookie crumbs. And, oh, look, Santa was here.
That's great.
Sure. And I remember one time we pretended that the Easter Bunny was in the backyard, and just swore that we had missed it.
Nice, nice. Good. Any others? Yes?
My dad was always a big someday never comes.
Uh-huh.
So whatever it is, that thing, just do it and do it now.
Yeah,
because someday
yeah.
never comes.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. Yes?
The other one was never borrow or lend or be.
Never borrow or lend. Anybody heard that one?
He was co-signing my first loan.
Yeah. My dad was kind of a perfectionist, and he liked to do woodworking, and he would say to me when I did something, he goes, look, if you're going to do it half-assed, don't do it at all, okay? So, the others? Good. Well, thank you for sharing with one another and telling some stories. I wanted to do a little poem in honor of my father. I wrote this last year, and I think you probably know most of what you need to know. My dad was a doctor. He was an eye surgeon. So he healed a lot of, he did a lot of cataract surgery and repaired cross eyes and stuff like that. But he loved to tell jokes to his patients. And this was often true. You'd see patients leaving my dad's office and they'd be smiling because he told them some goofy story or some joke. And he relaxed. Two of the ways he relaxed was he would come home and he would play the piano. I can still hear Mac the Knife on the piano. And then he also would, he had a little wood shop. He did simple woodworking projects. I often said that there are few problems in the world my dad couldn't solve with better shelving, right? If the world just had better shelving, everything would be better, you know? So a poem which is called A Prayer for My Father. My Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. You gave me daily the bread of yourself. You forgave me my ingratitude. You led me not into expectations, your expectations of my future, but towards a vision of mine own. Your love and labor seeded tenderness and discipline, courage and compassion upon my soul. Your surgeon's hands healed many, but your music, your medicine was laughter and music and story. You left so soon, but remind me to this day to be of good cheer, to be of service, to make things with wood and with words, to love and respect my sisters, to give the bread of myself freely to the world, and upon occasion to deliver people from melancholy and boredom with a joke or a story. For mine is a kingdom made from the soil of your sacrifice and love. All glory and honor to you, my Father, who art in heaven now and forever. That's my story. Thank you. Thank you. So to all the fathers and people that provide that fathering energy and time, we salute them. I wanted to finish with a story from Ireland. I just spent 5 weeks in Ireland and traveling all around. At one point, I went to a pub. Imagine that, you know, in Ireland. Yeah. Hard to believe, but I did. They dragged me in, and it actually was a pub in a little town called Doolin on the coast of County Clare. And it's a very famous place for music. They have fine music there. And it just so happened that I have a friend here in Oregon who knows the person that operates that pub. And her name is Patsy McDermott. And she and her family have operated that pub McDermott's in Doolin for 80 years. And so my friend Gary told her I was coming, and I showed up, and she said, oh, Gary's told us about you, and we're really glad to have you here. So we went in, and the place was absolutely packed, and there were 3 musicians on the stage, including a guy named Blackie O'Connell, an incredible player of the Uilleann pipes. And halfway through the music, Blackie said, well, it seems that we have a storyteller in the crowd here tonight, and so we're going to hear a story. And I was so dumb, I thought, oh, great, a storyteller. I can't wait for that, you know. I wonder who that is, you know. And then he says, and his name is William Kennedy Hornyak. And I went, oh, no. Oh, no, you know. And I stand up, and I get up on the stage, and I look, and the place is absolutely packed, you know. And we're in County Clare, and I just happen to know a story from County Clare. It's the one that I'm going to tell you. Anyway, I told that story. And first when I looked out, I said to everybody, I said, here's a story from County Clare. Has anybody heard of Biddy Early? And everybody's hand went up, and I went, oh, no. Oh, no, you know. But I told the story for about 15 minutes or so. It went fine. The musicians chimed in and played with me for a little bit. And then after, Patsy bought us a round and sat down. We had a great time. Right? But this is the story I told there. In Ireland, there are 4 provinces in Ireland. And each of those provinces has sort of its own identity, its own essence. And in the north is the province of Ulster, which is known for warfare, but also for martial strength and courage. And then Connaught is the western part, kind of the central and the northern part of the coast. Connaught is known as the place of knowledge and the place of magic. And then Leinster, which is where Dublin is, Leinster's in the east, the place where the sun rises first. It's known as the place of commerce and prosperity. And then Munster, which is in the far south and also on the coast, is known as the place of the greatest music and poetry, which in Ireland is saying something. You know? In Munster, they say that for every shovel for labor, there are 10 fiddles, right? Just to give you an idea of the value system there. Well, in Munster, one of the counties there is this County Clare. And this is a historical woman who lived there. Her name is Biddy Early. And Biddy means grandmother, or it's kind of a term of endearment as well. Biddy Early lived in a little village called Feakle in County Clare, East County Clare. And when she was a youth, 12 or 13, she had some encounter with what the Irish call the wee folk, or the good folk, or the wee people, you know, the ones that live in the hollow hills beneath the ground. And if they're treated well, they will return the favor tenfold. And she did some boon or gave some blessing to them. She helped them in some way. She never said what it was. But they gave her the gift of healing and also what they call second sight. She had a way of reading the future a little bit. So she became both an herb and berry woman, which meant that she knew the medicine of every root and bark and berry and leaf that grew all around her, and she knew how to take those and make them into some type of healing libation or elixir. And also, she was sort of a counselor. People would come to her and she would help them with their lives, help them figure things out. She was so popular and her healings were so sought after that people actually come and they would camp on her land to get a healing, or they would stay with friends. She never took any money for any healing or any session that she gave, because she said that to do that would be to insult the gift that I was given by the fairy folk. So everything is freely given, but still she had to live. And so people would bring her things. They would bring her a dozen eggs, or they would bring her a chicken, a loaf of bread. Oftentimes the men would bring her poitín, and poitín is Irish moonshine, you know. And what Biddy Early got, she freely gave. And so she found out that if you have free drink to give, you will often find people to come and drink it, you know. And so her place became sort of a healing center, and a place of counseling, a place of healing physical ailments, and also sort of a shebeen, a pub at the same time, you know. Anyway, one day she was very, very old as dirt, she herself would have said. And she was in the front room of her cottage. She lived in a whitewashed stone cottage with a traditional thatched roof. And she was in the front room with her broom. She was sweeping it up when all of a sudden a knock came to the door. And Biddy, she shuffled over to the door and she opened it up and she looked and she said, oh no. It was Death himself. It was the Grim Reaper right there with the long black robe on, and he had the scythe, you know, for harvesting human souls there. And he said, Grandmother, Biddy Early, I've come for you now. For every person has only so many years and months and weeks and days. And all your time's coming to an end, and you'll be coming with me now. And she said, oh, Death. She said, I knew you'd be coming for me, but I thought I had more years. I feel fine. Well, that's not the point here, Grandmother. Your time is up. You'll be coming with me. And she said, well, the fact is, I've lived a good life, a long life. I have loved, and I've been loved. And so I'll be coming with you, Death. Just as soon as I finish sweeping out the front room, because I'm not leaving a dirty house behind. And Death said, I don't think you seem to understand here, Grandmother. I'm Death, and you'll be coming with me now. And she said, I think there's something you don't understand here, young man. I've always respected the dead, and I would expect a bit of respect from you now. I'm not leaving a dirty house behind. And if you were to come in here and help me, and quit being such a layabout out there, maybe the two of us would get out of here all the sooner. And Death said, oh, bloody hell. Because he knew this was a woman you weren't going to argue with, you know. And so Death himself, he came into Biddy Early's room, and he took the broom, and he started trying to sweep out, you know, but he was tripping over it and fumbling around. He wasn't used to manual labor of any kind. And after a while, she had gone from the front room to the kitchen. And from the kitchen, she called out, she said, Death, you're not much good at that, I tell you what. Come in here, Death. Yes, come in here now. Take that knife there and cut up these potatoes, cut up those carrots. Because I'm making a stew. I don't want to leave any food go to waste. And he said, oh, Jesus, you know. And he's trying to cut these up, but the carrots are flying this way, potatoes are falling on the floor. And after a while, she said, oh, Death, I don't know what I'm going to do. I tell you what, Death. Put down the knife, go to the front door, go to the front room, stand by the door, because you see, guests are going to be coming soon to my house, because it's actually a party tonight, a birthday party tonight. My birthday party, obviously my last birthday party, and I want you to go stand by the door and welcome the guests as they come. You want me to welcome guests? And she said, well, you can't sweep. You can't cut up vegetables. Go out there, make yourself useful. He said, well, all right, you know. So Death himself, he goes to the front room, he stands by the door, and sure enough, after a while, people are coming up, you know, coming through the door, and Death says, welcome. But this is Ireland. People have seen far stranger things than this, you know. And after a while, of course, the whole room is filled with people. And it's Ireland, and people are having a shot and a pint, and they're chatting away and talking away, and the crack is good, the fun is great, you know, having a good time. And everyone's talking, except for Death. Nobody really knows what to say to him, and he doesn't really know what to say to them. But after a while, the food comes out, and then the birthday cake, and Grandmother Biddy Early's grandson, he's about 11, he brings a piece of cake over to Death. And he says, this is for you, sir. Here. And Death says, well, I'm Death. I don't eat any longer. He says, this birthday cake, it's for my grandmother. Here. And Death says, well, all right. And he took the cake, and he took a bite, you see, but beneath his robe, he was nothing more than bones. And so the cake just kind of bounced on his ribs and fell to the ground there. And of course, who noticed that but all the children? And there was soon a long line of them. They all wanted to feed Death, you know. But he was a good sport about it. He ate all the food they gave him, even drank the punch they served him, till there were puddles of punch and piles of food at his feet. But then the music started, you know, the penny whistles and the pipes came out, and the guitars and such, and the fiddles, and in no time people were up and they were dancing around, dancing away, and having a wonderful, wonderful time. Everybody was dancing. Well, everybody save for Death. He was in the corner there. But after a while, it might surprise you to know, somebody just walked over there and just pulled Death out onto the dance floor, you know. He was doing the best he could to dance, and after a while, someone else danced with Death, and then someone else, and Death danced with them and that person. And as the night wore on, everybody in the entire party danced with Death, and he danced with all of them. And the strangest thing was this. That party was among the most festive and interesting party, and lasted longer than any party Biddy Early had ever had. And she had had a number of parties. But it did come to an end. And finally, she and Death bid farewell to all the guests. And she turned to Death and she said, I want to thank you. I want to thank you, Death, for being patient with me and for letting me have my last birthday party, and I'm ready to go with you now. And didn't she reach out to him? And he reached that cold, bony hand of his out to her. I tell you what, Grandmother Biddy Early, how about if I come for you next year instead of this year? And she said, well, Death, that'd be fine, whatever you want to do. No, that would be better, I think. I can't remember when I've had such a good time. I rarely get invited to parties, you know, let alone having people dance with me and such. I'll come for you next year. And so Death, he went out the door. But of course, a year later, on that day, he came back. And that year, well, it was quite a bit like the first year, except for the fact Death was a little better at sweeping and cutting up the vegetables, you know. And the fact of the matter is, those parties with Death and Biddy Early went on for years and years and years and years. And the people of that village became quite well known as being quite wise and compassionate and empathetic and interesting and a bit weird too. And some of them would say, well, I don't know, maybe it's because we all dance with that Death on a rather regular basis. And even though he's not the most graceful of partners, he's certainly no one that we're afraid of. Oh, but they wanted me to make sure I told all of you there's another party coming up real soon, and all of us are invited. And that's Biddy Early Dances with Death. Thank you very much. I wanted to leave a little time if there's any questions or comments or discussion or anything like that, or any images that, you know, in the story. Sir? Yeah.
I don't know if you can help me with this, but it's been something I've been wondering about lately. You mentioned Joseph Campbell
Yeah.
at the beginning of your talk, and then I noticed both of your stories had, the women were the heroes of your stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been reading a lot of fantasy novels by women authors, and it seems like the formula for a woman hero is different than Joseph Campbell's classic Hero of a Thousand Faces formula. It seems the women, rather than needing to go off and have a mentor who teaches them all these great things and that they can powerfully do, the women have some power that's already in them, and then through the course of the adventure, they are able to uncover that and reveal that. So I just wonder if you've ever wondered about that.
I like that. I like that. I haven't thought of it that way, but yeah, I think there is some truth to that, you know. I also tell stories where there's very, you know, like outgoing women that have to go forward, and, you know, a lot of Celtic female heroes are like that because the warrior archetype is really strong in the Celtic feminine. But I think that's right, that a lot of, you know, women heroes, you know, you might say change things by healing or by changing perspective, you know, rather than, you know, having to use the, you know, the sword or power in that particular way.
Yeah, like even the kind of myth around Joan of Arc. She
Right.
didn't go and train to be a great warrior. She just went out and with her kind of heart and courage and spirit.
Yeah.
led to that.
It's interesting because when you look at Scheherazade, she definitely had a warrior spirit. She had incredible courage, but also she was a brilliant strategist because she knew if she attempted a frontal assault, she'd be dead. So how do you work around that, you know? And being in Ireland was interesting because, of course, if you know the history of Ireland, they've been under the domination of a larger power for a long time. So they've had to do a lot of workarounds. You know, one of the reasons why the Irish wit is very sharp and why they're so good with language and words and poetry and song is that that's been their method, you know, of healing and moving on. There's an old saying, too, that the victors write the history, the losers write the poetry, you know. So there's a lot of great Irish poets, you know. But that's a good point. Yeah, thank you. Something else?
I read or heard something recently about a more successful way of concocting or telling stories. The lesser way is you have an idea and you say and then and. Whereas if you say but as the joining factor for each step of the story is a much more interesting, colorful, almost a fork that's followed.
Mm-hmm.
So if I think we could all do that. Think on a story in your head, if you're saying something like, let's say, a road trip. If every little factor or part of the story is joined with but, it can make for a much more interesting story.
Yeah.
It takes you in a much better direction for
Right.
that,
Yeah.
for inventing that story. Whereas and just kind of feels like a straight road.
Right.
And then you
No, I like that. Yeah. Because then it's like, and they were having a great time, but. Yeah, one writer once said every novel would be improved if the second sentence was, and that's when the killing started. Well, Scheherazade, one of the reasons I think she was successful as a storyteller, too, was, I don't know if you're familiar that much with the 1001 Nights, the compilation of her stories, but those stories are outrageous, I mean, they're funny, they're raucous, some of them are bawdy, some of them are moral tales, some of them have to do with women, betraying, sultans, but also some have to do with women that are, saving the king or saving the Lord too. And so sometimes those stories touched the wound, you might say, of the sultan, became very close to what he was dealing with. And at other times they were just bawdy and raucous and funny. And I think that's one of the reasons that her storytelling approach worked. She wasn't attempting to think that one story is going to change his mind. She just trusted the idea of storytelling. And part of that is that, there's an old saying in Africa, is that you can't change this world if you always stay in this world. Right? That was from Malidoma Somé, who's from Burkina Faso, which means this, that if we always remain, in the 9 to 5, waking, literal world, right, we get a little stuck. And so the idea is that on a daily basis, to use the thresholds of storytelling and music and poetry and dance and drama and art and prayer and meditation or whatever it is for you, that helps you to cross the threshold of the here and now into the realm of imagination. Because that's where we can get different ideas. That's where we can get a vision and reseed ourselves with new possibility. And that's what Scheherazade realized that the Sultan had not done in a long time, which is what happens when we get into great pain. So one of the takeaways, I think, for us, or I know that for me, is that I try to become a literary omnivore as much as possible. Like I'll pick up, popular mechanics, and then I'll read Joseph Campbell, and I'll move on to some Irish novel, because I feel that I can't travel all over the place and meet everybody, but at least I can read. At least I can learn stories. And I remember years ago reading Maxine Hong Kingston, a brilliant writer, wrote a book called Warrior Woman. She lived in Sacramento and got a scholarship to go to Berkeley. Brilliant writer. I had no idea of the plight of a young woman growing up in California in Sacramento whose parents ran a laundry. But after reading that book, I did. I really understood how difficult it was for her, and also what it was like for many Chinese immigrants. Right? And so in part, I think what Scheherazade was doing was opening up the Sultan's perspective and saying, hey, there's other people that are living lives too. There's many ways of thinking and being and feeling and doing. We can't do all those things, but we can at least read about them or get a microcosm of those lives through story. So.
At the 5 points you gave about the elements that are helpful in the story, I'm a more Freudian-oriented psychotherapist, and that what you described is similar in some ways to good psychotherapy.
Yeah. Yeah, one therapist that I knew who was a Jungian, he said, long ago they didn't have psychology, but they had mythology, and they used that, and that does in part help us to understand the human predicament, So, I mean, if you ever want to talk about dysfunctional family values, read the Greek myths. It'll take you there. So, well, I'm going to give you a 2-minute story to finish. Is that okay? Have you got 2 minutes left in you? Okay, all right. So in Ireland, there were two farmers. They were neighbors. By the way, this is a story called The Failed Conversation. In Ireland, there is a saying, this is true, there's a saying that a writer is actually a failed conversationalist. You know? And this is a story about a man who probably should have been a writer because he couldn't really carry on much of a conversation. Anyway, there was Pat McCarthy and Mike Flaherty, and they had two adjoining farms way out in the west of Ireland, and they helped each other out for years and years and years. But one day, Pat's uncle was ill. He lived in Dublin, and Pat had to go all the way to Dublin, and he cared for him for 4 months. And then he made his way home. But while he was gone, his good friend Mike watched after his farm. And now the day finally came when Pat arrived at the railway station, and who was there to greet him with the buggy? It was the old days, buggy, you know, and the horse, but Mike. And now they were making their way from the railway station all the way back to Pat's farm on the long ride. And that's when Pat turned to Mike and he said, Mike, these months that I've been gone, you know, what's the news? And Mike said, well, there really hasn't been any news. Well, not since your dog died anyway. He says, oh, the dog died. Well, that's a shame. Well, Mike, how did the dog die? Well, I'm not certain. Perhaps it was some of the burnt horsefish he ate after the barn burned down. You know, he says, Jesus, the barn burned down? Well, Mike, how did that happen? Well, I'm not certain, but I'm assuming it was sparks from the house. It was a windy night that night, you know. He says, the house was on fire. Oh, it was. It's not any longer. It burned to the ground along with your barn. Says, the house burned down? Well, Mike, how did that happen? Now, that I can tell you. In fact, wasn't I warning them all that night? Oh, I was. I was warning them all. I said, you shouldn't be lighting all these candles in a wood-framed house. It's dangerous, you know. Oh, but they said to me, Mike, you have to have candles around the coffin, you know. It's customary at a wake, you know. Well, they caught a wake. Someone died? Yeah, I'm afraid it was your poor mother-in-law that took sick and died. Says, nothing could have killed her. How did she die? I'm not certain, Pat, but I'm assuming heart attack, I think. Just the shock of seeing your wife run off with that young priest, that Father Kelly, you know. My wife run off with a priest? My mother-in-law's dead, my house is burned to the ground, and the barn horses have been killed. You say there hasn't been any news? No, like I said, Pat, not since the dog died. It's called The Failed Conversation. Sorry about that. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.